The wind had teeth that morning, cold and wet and biting. It came through the cottonwoods along the split-rail fence and rattled the tin roof of the chicken coop like a warning. Elias Blackfox stepped out onto the porch with a steaming mug of coffee in one hand and a tired scowl stitched across his face. His bones felt the storm before the clouds rolled in, same as always. He didn't need the sky to tell him trouble was coming. He could hear it in the silence of the animals, in the way the crows circled wide instead of landing. He'd just taken a seat on the edge of the porch when he saw movement down the trail, a limp figure trudging through the frost-cracked mud, two smaller shapes trailing behind like ghosts in worn-out shoes. His fingers tightened around the mug. The woman stumbled, once caught herself, then kept walking. Her hair hung in wet, dark tangles over her face. One of the children girls, he realized, tried to help her steady. The other lagged, dragging something that looked like a pillowcase full of scraps. Elias stood slowly, heart-knocking against old ribs, not from fear, but from something worse, recognition. That look on her face, he'd seen it once in the mirror after they buried his wife and unborn child beneath the blackjack oak. When she reached the fence, her voice cracked the stillness. "Please, take my girls." No greeting. No explanation. Just those 5 words carved out of wind and desperation. He didn't move. Her lips were blue. One sleeve was torn at the elbow. "They haven't eaten in 2 days. I've got nothing left. I'll work for you." "You don't even have to pay me, just don't turn us away." Elias stepped off the porch. The smaller girl coughed a wet rattling sound that didn't belong in a child's chest. The older one, maybe 9, kept her arms around the younger's shoulders, her face like a stone. "What's your name?" Elias asked, voice rough from disuse. "Miranda. Miranda Whitlow. This is Delia and Maisie." He looked at the 3 of them, wet, shaking, brittle as corn husks after harvest, and something shifted inside him. Something slow, aching. The girls weren't hers by looks. One was freckled and pale, the other dark with storm-colored eyes. Didn't matter. They clung to her like she was the only solid thing left in the world. He nodded toward the porch. "Get them out of the wind." Miranda didn't thank him. She didn't smile, just wrapped an arm around each girl and limped up the steps like her legs might give out. Elias opened the door and motioned them inside. The smell of pine ash and bacon grease hit them as they entered. It was warmer than the wind, but not by much. He stirred the stove fire with the toe of his boot tossing in another log. Miranda sank to the floor near the hearth, drawing the girls close like hens covering chicks. Elias poured the rest of his coffee into a tin cup and handed it to her. "Thank you," she murmured, lips barely moving. Delia looked at the cup with longing. Miranda held it away from the girls watching him. "They can have it," Elias said. Miranda hesitated. Then she passed it to Delia, who took the smallest sip and handed it to Maisie. The younger girl cradled it with both hands like it was gold. "I got beans and cornbread," Elias offered. Miranda nodded, eyes down. "Only if you've enough. I got plenty." The food was plain, but the girls devoured it like they hadn't seen a real meal in weeks. Miranda waited until they were done, then took the last crumb for herself. She wiped Maisie's mouth with her sleeve and murmured something too soft to catch. Elias leaned against the counter, arms crossed, watching. Not suspicious, just measuring the weight of things. Miranda sat up straighter under his gaze. "We came from Gentry. My husband's brother." Her voice snagged. "We couldn't stay. Trouble with the law, no. Trouble with the kind that ain't illegal, just evil." He nodded once. "You can stay the night. I'll clear a place in the loft." She nodded back, one hand still resting on Maisie's back, as if afraid someone might take her if she let go. He fetched 2 wool blankets from the cedar chest. The girls curled up near the stove. Miranda didn't lay down until their breathing evened. She didn't ask for a bed. Didn't ask for anything. That night, Elias couldn't sleep. The house, usually full of quiet, now held the sound of breath that wasn't his. Little rustles. A soft whimper. He watched the moon through the warped glass window and wondered what kind of world left women like Miranda crawling through mud, with nothing but 2 children and a shredded coat. In the early dark, he found her outside the door, knees folded beneath her, staring into the woods. Her hair was damp from dew. She didn't look up when he approached. "You ain't safe out here," he said gently. "Neither are they," she whispered. "But they're warmer than they've been in weeks." He didn't ask what she meant. He knew the signs, the twitch at loud sounds, the way the girls flinched from shadows. He'd seen it before in the eyes of wounded animals too proud to die. "You got family? No one who'll have us." He watched a branch bend under the weight of a crow. "Then I guess you got me." Miranda turned her head, startled. "What work's startin' soon? Fences to mend. Winter ain't through with us yet." He paused. "I don't need a housemaid." But the place could use voices again. A long silence stretched between them. The breeze pulled strands of her hair across her cheek. "You mean that she asked?" "I wouldn't say it if I didn't." She nodded, slow and cautious. Not trust, but something like hope. The barest flicker of it. Inside, the fire crackled low. The girls shifted in their sleep. Elias stepped aside, letting Miranda go in first. As she passed, she murmured, "We won't cause trouble." He didn't answer. Trouble was already here, coiled up in scars and silence. But maybe, just maybe this time, it came with a reason. And just beyond the fence, the wind blew again, sharper, louder, like it had questions of its own. She wouldn't touch the bread unless her daughters ate first, like someone who'd lived too long on fear and leftover crumbs. Elias noticed the pattern before the sun had even made it over the ridge. He rose early, like always, and found Miranda already crouched near the stove, feeding the fire, like she'd always lived here. But she hadn't. Not by a long shot. Delia sat folded in on herself near the hearth, rubbing her arms through a too thin flannel shirt. Maisie, still half asleep, leaned into her mother's lap. The moment Elias placed the skillet on the stove, Miranda was up with her hands out. "You don't have to cook. I can do it," she said. Her voice had that too careful lilt, like a dog used to being struck mid-step. "I'm not dead yet," Elias replied, cracking eggs into the pan. "You're still healing." Miranda looked like she wanted to argue, but instead returned to the girls. When breakfast was set, cornbread, eggs, coffee, she broke the bread in half and gave it to Delia. Maisie got the rest. Miranda took nothing. Elias said nothing at first, just sipped his coffee and watched her eyes track every bite her daughters took, as though rationing their future on the edge of a tin plate. "I've got more," he said. "I know. Then eat." She hesitated, then tore off the smallest corner of cornbread left on Maisie's plate, swallowed it dry. He got up, scooped another square, and set it beside her. "I won't have ghosts at my table, Miranda. You're here, so eat like it." Her jaw clenched. She nodded once and took a bite. After the dishes were scrubbed and set to dry, Elias grabbed his coat. "I'll be out checking fence lines. You're welcome to rest." "I can help," she said too quickly. "Not with a bum leg and 2 kids to mind. I'm not made of glass." "No, but you're worn thin." He said it without bite, without pity. Just a fact, and facts didn't need softening. She backed down, retreating toward the girls. Outside, the wind had died down, but the chill hadn't. The sky hung low, pregnant with clouds that might break by dusk. Elias kept his steps slow as he trudged along the fence line. Some rails were loose, others barely holding by iron nails bent from storms past. He worked with method: hammer, brace, move, repeat. The rhythm calmed him. At noon he returned to find the girls dozing near the hearth and Miranda seated at the table sewing a torn curtain panel she must have dug out from the closet. She'd braided her hair back. Her hands moved with practiced patience. "Didn't peg you for a curtain mender," Elias said. "Didn't peg you for a man who lets strangers sleep on his floor." He gave a short grunt that might have been a laugh. Miranda held his gaze just long enough to leave a mark before returning to her stitches. After supper, Elias brought down a bundle of old linens, setting them beside the hearth. "For the loft," he said. "You and the girls should have beds tonight." She touched the fabric with a reverence he hadn't expected. "You're giving us these, I don't need 'em. Got no use for extra anything." Maisie stood and tugged at Elias's sleeve. "Do you have cookies?" He blinked. "Cookies, Papa used to bring us one when we were good," Maisie Miranda warned softly. Elias scratched his beard. "Can't say I've got cookies, but there's molasses in the pantry. I reckon that counts for something." Maisie smiled, a small, sticky thing, and then curled back under the blanket. That night, Elias climbed the stairs to the loft ahead of them, lit the oil lamp, and set out 2 extra quilts. He didn't stay to watch them settle. It wasn't his place. But down below, as he poured himself a last cup of coffee, he heard the girls whispering, and Miranda's voice humming quiet and low, the sound of something returning. Sometime after midnight, the storm broke. The wind slammed into the cabin walls with a howl that sounded almost human. The window panes rattled. Rain pelted the roof in sheets. Elias sat up in bed, listening. A minute passed. Then footsteps, bare and frantic. He swung his legs out just as the loft ladder creaked. Delia appeared first, her face pale and tight with fear. "She's not waking up," she whispered. "Mama's not waking up." Elias stood fast, heart-lurching. Maisie was right behind her, crying. He found Miranda curled in a ball on the floor of the loft, shaking violently. The storm had dredged something from her, something bigger than wind and thunder. Her hands were curled over her ears, her breathing shallow and quick. "She was fine when we went to sleep," Delia said, her voice trembling. Then the wind came, and she started whispering. Elias knelt beside her and gently touched her shoulder. "Miranda." She flinched violently, gasping, "It's Elias. You're all right. You're safe." She blinked through the dim light eyes, unfocused. Sweat slicked her brow. He didn't touch her again, just sat beside her, back against the wall. "You're not in that place anymore," he said quietly. "The roof won't cave in. Nobody's coming through the door." The girls pressed into his sides, one on each shoulder. Slowly, Miranda's breath began to slow. After a long silence, she rasped the cellar. "We hid in the cellar when it stormed." Delia nodded. She always said it was the only safe place. "All right," Elias said. "Let's go." He took a lantern and led them down to the root cellar. Cold, damp, musty. But Miranda crawled onto the straw-covered floor and held her daughters like the ground itself could protect them. Elias stayed nearby, sitting against a barrel of dried beans. He didn't speak, didn't move, just waited. Eventually, Miranda's voice broke the silence. "Thank you for not touching what's not offered." Elias said nothing. He understood. There were things you survived with your body that your mind was still outrunning. In the morning, the cellar door creaked open. Light filtered in through the dust. "I made coffee," Elias said. Miranda blinked at him. "Why? Because you're still here, and so are they." The girls stirred. Miranda sat up, looking around the small, earth-scented room. And for the first time since she'd arrived, she smiled. Not big, not sure, but real. The kind of smile that makes room for something else. Something like healing. Above them, the wind was gentler now. The worst of the storm had passed, though the land was still soaked, and the trees still leaned. Elias looked out across the pasture, then back toward the porch. He knew someone else needed to see what had shifted, someone who understood silent stories and the weight of names never spoken. He stepped off the porch and into the yard. The morning was cool, but it held a strange stillness. He saddled his horse. Time to fetch Uncle Finch. She never touched the knife drawer, but kept staring at it like it had teeth and memory. The door creaked open on the third morning just past dawn. Elias had barely finished washing out the old coffee pot when he saw her standing there, Miranda pale in the gray morning light, her eyes fixed on the kitchen drawers like they might reach for her. She wasn't trembling, not visibly. But something in her body stood too still, like a deer measuring distance between fear and flight. Elias didn't say anything. He poured a second mug and left it at the end of the table, then stepped outside into the cold, leaving the door cracked enough to let in wood smoke and light. By the time he came back in, she'd sipped the coffee and started boiling water. Her daughters were still asleep upstairs, their soft breaths filtering down through the ceiling boards. He noticed it again, how she never opened the drawers. She rummaged in cabinets, searched shelves, handled the stove like an old friend. But the drawer where he kept knives, she gave it a berth like it growled. "You can move things around," Elias said casually. "Ain't no particular order to anything." Miranda shook her head once. "It's fine." Elias didn't push. Some scars didn't need names. They just needed time. By mid-morning, he saddled his horse and made for the ridge trail that led to Finch's cabin. The woods thinned out there where the wind cut harder, and trees leaned from years of storms. He found Finch seated on a stump knife in hand, carving a bear from cedar. "You came with wind in your boots," the old man said, without looking up. "Had a woman and 2 girls show up?" Elias replied. "She asked me to take them." Finch didn't pause the blade. "And you did?" "Didn't see another choice." Finch chuckled. "You always got a choice, boy. But maybe you made the only right one." Elias dismounted and crouched beside the elder. "She's skittish, wears her guard like armor. Kids, too. They eat like rabbits and sleep like they might be dragged off." Finch sliced a sliver off the bear's snout and brushed it away. "That kind of pain doesn't wash off. But if they're in your house, they're on sacred land now. You best treat it like that." "I know," Elias said. "Do they speak? Not much." "One girl hasn't said a word. The other only talks when it's quiet enough to hear your own breath." Finch ran his hand over the carving and set it aside. "Bring them to me." Back at the ranch, the girls were outside near the coop, watching a half-dozen hens kick at the straw. Miranda stood by the fence, arms crossed, shawl wrapped tight. When she saw Elias ride in with Finch behind him, her shoulders tensed, eyes darting. "It's all right," Elias called. "This is my uncle. He's family." Finch slid off the horse without help, tapping his walking stick once against the dirt. Though blind since birth, he moved with careful assurance. He tilted his head. "I smell children." Maisie giggled. "That's us." Miranda stepped forward, her voice low. "He can't see better than most," Elias said. Finch turned toward the voice. "You must be their mother." Miranda hesitated, then nodded. "Miranda Whitlow." He smiled. "Good name. Strong. Like a ridge that don't bend in storms." Delia stepped forward, then a carved stick in her hand. "I found this in the barn," she said. "Can I whittle it?" Finch held out his palm. She placed it there, quiet and reverent. He ran his fingers over the surface, slow, seeing with every ridge and knot. "This wood's stubborn," he murmured. "Takes patience. You got patience, little one." Delia shrugged. "I got nothing else." Finch smiled and knelt. "Then I'll teach you, one day at a time." They spent that afternoon on the porch. Finch carved in rhythm, guiding Delia's small hands. Miranda sat nearby, mending a ripped hem on Maisie's dress. Elias fixed a broken hinge on the coop door, all the while watching the strange calm bloom between strangers. Later, as dusk crept in, Delia tapped her stick against Finch's boot. "How do you know what to make?" "The wood tells me," he replied. "Everything's got a shape inside it. My job's just to find it." Miranda looked up, then something shifting behind her eyes. That night, as the girls curled up in the loft, Miranda stayed downstairs and wiped the table clean with slow, deliberate strokes. Elias sat by the hearth oil lamp, throwing shadows across the walls. "He didn't flinch when Delia spoke," she said. "He listens different than most. She hasn't talked to anyone since before." Elias nodded, waiting. "She said once that Jeb used to lock her in the barn. Said talking only made things worse." His hands curled around his coffee mug. "What about you? I talked too much. Then not enough. Then he said I had nothing left worth hearing." She wiped the cloth over a knot in the table again and again. "I hated that barn," she said, "but it was better than the cellar." Elias set the mug down. "You're not there now." Miranda looked at him, and for the first time she let that truth settle. "I still hear it," she said, "when the wind blows too hard, when the house gets too quiet." He nodded once, slow. "That's why Finch came." Miranda sat down across from him. "You always so calm when strangers bleed all over your floor." "No," he said. "Only when I see something worth the mess." She blinked. Then she smiled tight, almost pained, but real. Upstairs, Maisie turned in her sleep. Delia whispered Finch's name like a prayer. Elias leaned back in his chair and listened to the wind outside. It wasn't sharp tonight, just tired like it had spent itself. In the barn, the hens clucked softly and the fence stayed standing. Tomorrow he'd take them to town. They needed shoes and supplies and faces that didn't twist with judgment. But tonight, he watched Miranda tuck a blanket around her daughters, sit beside them, and hum. And when her eyes drifted to the knife drawer again, she didn't flinch. She just breathed. A woman can survive shame, but not when it's echoed by every face in town. The wagon wheels creaked as they rolled down into town, mud sucking at the wooden spokes like it wanted to keep them from passing. Elias held the reins loose, letting the old mule choose its pace. Beside him, Miranda sat stiff and silent, her jaw clenched as tight as her hands wrapped in the edge of her shawl. In the back, Delia and Maisie huddled together with a flour sack of clothes and the carved stick Finch had given Delia 2 days before. Spring sun didn't warm much, not with the way people looked when you showed up with strangers in the seat beside you. They passed the church first. The bell was still, but the windows glittered with a few watchful eyes. Then came the feed store where old Roy Merton spat in the dirt and squinted long at the wagon, muttering something to his son. Miranda dropped her gaze to her lap. She hadn't spoken a word since they'd left the ranch. "We need shoes," Elias said softly, eyes fixed ahead. "And flour sugar. Beans if they got 'em." She nodded once. The general store door jingled when they stepped inside, the heavy scent of oiled wood and tobacco wrapping around them. Mr. Elbert stood behind the counter, polishing his spectacles, even though they were already clean. Elias tipped his hat. "Morning." "Mornin'." Elbert replied, eyes flitting from Elias to Miranda, then to the girls behind them. Looks like you picked up strays. Miranda stiffened. Elias stepped forward. They're staying with me now. Elbert arched a brow. You open in a boarding house, Black Fox. I'm buying boots. Elbert leaned his elbows on the counter. For them, he jerked his chin toward the girls. They don't got coin. I do. Elbert smirked. That ain't what I asked. Elias reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a rolled wad of bills. Ain't what I care about either. Behind them, someone laughed thin and sour. 2 women had entered the store. Elias recognized them, both Clara Simmons and Mavie Hurst, churchgoers, whisperers. Mavie leaned in toward Clara and murmured, Did you hear she's not even his wife? Mercy Clara breathed, bringing children into a man's house like that. Miranda's hands shook at her sides. Delia clutched her carved stick. Maisie whimpered. Elias turned slow as thunder rolling in. I hear one more word, he said, and I'll be back with the sheriff to ask what you meant by it. Clara bristled. Well, no need to get harsh. We're just saying. You weren't saying. You were judging. His voice dropped. And your church is going to need to preach double hard this Sunday to forgive it. The women backed out without another word. Elbert cleared his throat and shuffled behind the counter. Boots are on the left wall. Sugar's gone up a cent. Then you better lower the salt to balance it. They left with 2 pairs of boots, a sack of flour-lard dried apples, and enough judgment to sink a mule. Miranda didn't speak until they were back in the wagon riding past the chapel again. You didn't have to do that. Sure I did. It'll follow you. It already does. She looked down at her new boots, then at the girls, Maisie asleep against Delia's shoulder. I thought if we left him, the world might feel bigger. It is. Not in towns like this. Elias handed her a small muslin bag. Inside were 2 peppermint sticks. For them. Her hand trembled slightly as she took them. They rode in silence until the ridge where the road forked between the church trail and the valley path. As they turned toward the hills, a voice called out from behind. Elias Black Fox. He pulled the reins gently. The wagon slowed. Hattie Juniper stood by the edge of the trail, arms crossed, apron stained with herbs. Her gray braids swung over one shoulder, her face sun-warmed and fierce. You didn't come by for salve like you said. Got sidetracked. Her eyes narrowed at Miranda, then softened. Bring those girls by tomorrow. Delia's got a cough hanging in her chest and Maisie needs tonic. Miranda blinked. You know their names. I know the sound of people clinging to grace. Hattie stepped closer, voice lowering. And I know what Clara and Mavie said. Elias waited for the sharpness, but Hattie's voice turned quieter, almost reverent. They said the same thing about me once. Called me a witch. Said I took in orphans and ghosts. Miranda opened her mouth, then closed it again. Hattie smiled. If you can't live holy, live brave. That's what I always say. The wagon rolled on past dogwood trees just starting to bloom, their petals soft against the bare branches. The trail climbed higher. By the time they reached the fence line, the sun had begun to lower warm and gold across the pasture. That night after supper, Elias set the peppermint sticks on the table. Delia hesitated. Maisie squealed, grabbing hers and holding it like treasure. Miranda picked at her food, but didn't speak. When the girls went to bed, she stayed behind, staring at the fire until it was only embers. I hated that store, she whispered. It felt like every bruise I've ever carried got paraded through that room. They don't get to write your story. She looked at him. But they'll try. Elias stirred the coals. Let 'em talk. The ones worth knowing will listen quieter." She laughed once, dry, unexpected. "That's some Cherokee wisdom." "No," he said, meeting her eyes. "That's mine." She smiled, faint but sure. Outside, the night wind stirred the porch lantern, making it creak. Elias moved to check the lock on the back door, but paused when he saw a small figure moving behind the curtains. Delia, holding her carved stick, turning it over in her hands, like it might become something more. He stepped away, letting her be. Some things, like shape and voice, had to be found, not forced. And just beyond the hills, the dust of another rider began to rise. Far off, still but steady. Elias didn't see it yet. But trouble had a way of riding quiet, until it stood right at your gate. She froze when the flames licked the pot, like someone waiting for a fist, not a rescue. The smell of lard and onions hung in the cabin like something warm and promising. Miranda stood by the stove sleeves rolled up, stirring a bubbling pot of beans with a wooden spoon. Her hair was tied back in a kerchief, and her shoulders for once weren't hunched. Elias watched from the porch boots propped on the railing, a faint whistle rising from between his teeth. It wasn't a tune exactly, just the sound of peace while it lasted. Delia and Maisie played in the dirt nearby, pretending to build a house for a beetle they'd found. Miranda had started humming softly off-key, but soothing when the grease snapped. A flick of flame leapt from the skillet to the edge of the towel draped over the counter. In an instant, the cloth caught fire. Miranda's hum cut off. Her body went rigid. She stared at the flame as it crawled toward the oil can. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. Her fingers clenched the spoon so hard the wood creaked. The fire wasn't big, not yet, but her mind had already gone somewhere else. Somewhere darker. Miranda Elias's voice cracked through the moment. She didn't move. He was through the door in 2 strides, grabbing the towel and smothering the flame beneath his boot. Smoke hissed and curled toward the ceiling, the kitchen filled with a sharp, burnt scent. The girls ran to the doorway, eyes wide. Elias turned still, catching his breath, and saw Miranda standing exactly where she'd been, spoon still in hand, face pale and empty. He spoke gently. "It's out." She didn't answer. Elias reached forward slowly, like approaching a spooked colt. He took the spoon from her hand and set it on the table. "You're all right. You're here." Her lips moved, but only air came out. Maisie's voice came from behind him, whisper small. Mama Miranda blinked. She looked at Elias, then past him, and her knees buckled. He caught her before she hit the floor. She didn't cry, didn't make a sound. Just sat there shaking as if every bone in her had turned to ice. Elias didn't try to make her stand. He crouched beside her, one hand resting lightly on her back. The girls stood by the doorway, uncertain. "You're safe," he said. "It's over." She finally spoke. It smelled like that day, like hot iron and fat and him. Elias closed his eyes briefly. He didn't ask which him. Miranda stared at the hearth like it was still lit. "He dragged me across the floor by my apron strings once, because the stew boiled over." Delia stepped inside and knelt beside her mother, wrapping thin arms around her waist. Miranda looked down and pulled her close. Maisie crept in, clutching her peppermint stick, and leaned against Miranda's side. "I'm sorry," Miranda whispered. "I should have moved." "You didn't have to," Elias said. "I was watching." That evening, Miranda insisted on finishing dinner. She stirred with steadier hands this time, and Elias stayed close, chopping carrots and watching the shadows on the wall. "I used to flinch when I heard boots coming down the hall," she said almost absently. "Not yours, though. Yours sound different." Elias didn't know what to do with that. He simply passed her the salt and said, Then I'll keep walking slow. After supper, while the girls chased fireflies near the barn, Miranda lingered at the table. Back then, she said, I thought it was my fault. Every bruise, every broken plate. He said I stirred wrong, spoke wrong, breathed wrong. Elias sat down across from her. The oil lamp between them flickered with wind. You know that wasn't true. I do now. But knowing and believing ain't the same thing. No, it ain't. She traced the rim of her cup. I keep waiting for you to change, to get tired, angry. I don't rattle easy, Elias said. And I don't raise my hand unless there's a snake in the crib. Miranda laughed, short and sharp. That's a phrase I haven't heard before. My mother used to say it. She was full of odd sayings. They sat in quiet for a while. Outside, the wind had died down. The girls came in, cheeks flushed and eyes heavy with sleep. Delia turned back toward the door. I forgot my stick. I'll fetch it, Miranda offered. Elias stood. I'll go. She hesitated. I should learn to walk out in the dark again. You will, but tonight rest. He stepped outside. The moon hung low, pale and heavy. He crossed the yard to the barn and found the carved stick lying near the coop. As he turned to walk back, something in the distance caught his eye, just a flicker of movement far down the ridge. Maybe a deer, maybe something else. Too far to tell. He made a note of it, tucked the thought away like he did with storm signs and split rail sounds. Inside, he handed the stick to Delia, who hugged it like a doll and curled up beside Maisie. Miranda stood at the window, arms wrapped around herself. I'll clean the stovetop tomorrow. It's just a stovetop. No, it's more than that. He didn't argue. As he turned to leave, her voice stopped him. Thank you for not touching what's not offered. Elias turned slowly, catching the weight behind her words. Her back was still to him, but her voice was steady. Some men take silence as permission, she said. You don't. I take silence as what it is, sacred. She nodded, still not looking at him. That matters. He tipped his hat, though she couldn't see it, and stepped outside again. The air was cooling fast and clouds were building over the far ridge. Not storm clouds yet, but thinking about it. He checked the fence before heading in for the night. The boards held. The chickens were settled. The porch lantern creaked but steady. Tomorrow the ground would soften enough to plant. The girls had asked about a little garden. Miranda mentioned herbs. Maybe that would come next. But Elias kept thinking about that flicker on the ridge, because peace never stayed long, not when a man like Jebediah Whitlow was still breathing. When she planted herbs in the garden, I knew it wasn't just for tea, it was a prayer in dirt. The shovel sank into the thawed earth with a low crunch, the kind that told you spring had taken root for good. Miranda knelt at the edge of the garden bed, sleeves rolled to her elbows, hands caked with black soil. Her fingers moved through the dirt with reverence, like she was touching something sacred. Elias watched from the porch, coffee and hand boots crossed at the ankle. She hadn't asked permission to plant. She didn't need to. Delia crouched beside her mother, separating sprigs of mint and basil with care. Maisie waddled around in her new boots, trailing a string behind her, with a button tied at the end. The child's giggle floated across the yard every time she caught a bug or weed she declared too ugly to grow. Miranda wiped her forehead with her wrist and leaned back. I used to keep an herb box on the windowsill. It died the year Jeb boarded up the kitchen light. Elias said nothing, just sipped his coffee. I thought if I kept something green alive, maybe I'd stay that way too. He nodded once slow. Looks like you're doing both just fine now. She smiled without looking up. We'll see if the roots hold. The land had softened in more ways than one. The girls were laughing more. Miranda had even sung once while washing dishes, though she stopped when she realized he'd heard her. Elias made no comment, just hummed along like he didn't notice. The wind had lost its bite. Finch visited most afternoons now, resting under the shade tree and telling stories with a piece of cedar in his lap. Delia brought him new sticks to whittle, and Miranda made dandelion tea that she swore helped him sleep better. Elias had almost allowed himself to believe this quiet might last. But that morning, he saw dust rising from the ridge trail. It wasn't from a wagon or the wind. It rose too straight, too slow. A rider. By mid-afternoon, Miranda had brewed a pot of stew, and Maisie was dancing with a wooden spoon on the porch. Elias walked past her with a fresh armful of wood and caught Miranda's eye through the kitchen window. "Someone's coming," he said. She froze, ladle suspended above the pot. How far still a ways. Single horse. Coming steady. She set the ladle down. Her hands went to the collar of her dress, tugging at a button that didn't need fixing. Could be anyone, he said, but they both knew better. Delia crept down the stairs. "Is it him? I don't know," Elias said. "But just in case, let's be ready." Miranda pulled Maisie off the porch and into the house. She moved with purpose, not panic, closing windows, tucking the girl's shoes under the cot, setting her jaw like a soldier reloading. Elias stepped into the barn and grabbed the rifle. Not the polished one that hung over the mantel, but the older lever action with the worn grip. He didn't load it. Not yet, but he set it by the porch, leaning against the post, like a silent boundary line. The dust trail got closer. They could hear hooves now. Finch arrived just before sundown, led by the faint scent of stew and a gut instinct too sharp to explain. "You feel it?" Elias asked. Finch nodded. Storm in the blood. They stood together facing the ridge. Miranda came out, Maisie in her arms, Delia close behind. Her face was pale, but her spine straight. Then the rider crested the hill. A tall man on a bay horse. Wide shoulders, dusty coat, black hat pulled low. Miranda's breath hitched. "It's him." Elias didn't move. He watched the man slow his horse as he reached the fence line. The animal pawed at the ground. The man looked at the house, at the smoke curling from the chimney, and at the group standing quiet and still. Jebediah Whitlow dismounted. He didn't smile, just tipped his hat like he had every right to be there. "Well," he said, "ain't this the picture?" No one answered. Jeb's gaze landed on Miranda. "I came for what's mine." She flinched but stepped forward. "We're not yours," he smirked. "The law says otherwise. You're still my kin, and them girls carry my brother's blood. They carry their own names," Miranda said. "And so do I." Delia reached for Elias's hand. He took it firm and steady. "I didn't come for talk," Jeb said. "I came to bring 'em home. You'll turn around," Elias replied, voice flat. "Or what?" Elias stepped off the porch. "Or you'll find yourself walking back without a horse or your teeth." Jeb took a step forward. "You think you can keep them hidden out here, living like squatters on charity? Folks in town already talking." "They talk," Finch rasped, "but they don't listen. Not to cowards." Jeb's eyes narrowed. "You ain't the law." "No," Elias said, "but I'm the land you're standing on, and it says you're not welcome." Jeb's jaw worked as he glanced at the rifle by the porch. He wasn't a fool, but he'd always counted on fear doing his fighting for him. When he spoke again, his voice was lower. "You're gonna regret this." Elias met his eyes. "Not as much as you'll regret crossing this fence again." Jeb didn't respond. He just spat in the dirt, mounted his horse, and rode off without another word. The dust followed him back up the ridge, slower now. Miranda exhaled, knees buckling slightly. Elias caught her elbow. She straightened, jaw tight. I thought I was ready. You were, Elias said. You still are. Delia and Maisie stayed close that night. The stew went uneaten. Miranda sat by the window watching the trail until moonlight washed it clean. Elias didn't press her, but he knew what she was thinking. Jeb would come back. And next time he'd bring more than words. He'd bring proof, a name, the law. And there was only one way to stop him for good. Elias poured 2 cups of coffee and set one beside her. When she looked at him, he didn't flinch. Marry me, he said. Not for love, not for show. For them. Miranda didn't blink. Her hand wrapped around the cup, and she nodded. The law may call you kin, but my girls only run from one kind of man. The next morning came cold and bright, with a stillness that felt unnatural. No wind, no birds, not even the familiar groan of the barn door in its hinge. Miranda stood on the porch with a tin cup in hand, staring out at the trail like it might sprout another storm. The night before hadn't settled in her bones yet. Elias stepped outside beside her shoulder, brushing hers quiet. She sipped the coffee and finally spoke. You meant it. I don't say things I don't mean. A marriage, he nodded once. For protection. And for truth, he said. They're your girls. But they've been mine too in every way that counts. Miranda set the cup down. Then we do it soon. Before Jeb finds some loophole to drag us back into hell. Elias watched her jaw tighten. Today, she nodded. Before the sun drops. He didn't ask again. Hattie Juniper arrived by midday. Finch came not long after, trailing the scent of cedar and smoke. He brought a small cross he'd carved from redwood plane, smooth with the edges sanded down like something meant to be held, not just seen. No preacher, Miranda said as Hattie stepped through the door. No church, just us. Quiet. Hattie tied her apron tighter and grinned. Then let's make it honest. The cabin was cleared. The table was pushed to the wall. Elias wore his cleanest shirt, the collar still stiff from lack of use. Miranda wore the same dark blue dress she'd arrived in, patched, worn, but whole. Delia stood beside Finch, clutching her carved stick like a torch. Maisie picked a few purple wildflowers and handed them to Hattie with wide eyes. The vows were few. Hattie didn't read from scripture. She simply looked them both in the eye and said, Do you come of your own will? Elias nodded. Miranda whispered, Yes. Then by the laws of God, land, and stubborn people who refuse to be undone by cruelty, this is done. Finch stepped forward and pressed the redwood cross into Miranda's hand. It's not to hang, he said. It's to carry when the nights get long. Delia looked up at Elias. Are you our papa now? He knelt. I was the moment you set foot on my porch. Maisie slipped her hand into his. You don't yell? Never needed to, he said. I just stand. That evening, the 5 of them ate cornbread and beans on the porch, the girls giggling every time Elias used the wrong spoon or let Maisie sit on his knee. Miranda watched from the rocker, her bare feet tucked beneath her. Her eyes softened, but never fully dropped their guard. Later, after the girls were asleep and the house had settled into the hush that comes only with full bellies and safe walls, Miranda found Elias out by the fence. He leaned against the post hat, tipped back eyes on the stars. I thought marriage would feel like a trap again, she said. He didn't look over. Does it? No. It feels like a gate. One I get to close behind me. He nodded. You're not fenced in. You're fenced out from the world that hurt you. She stepped closer. You'll sleep in the barn tonight. He finally met her eyes. If that's what keeps you sleeping easier. She hesitated, then reached for his hand. Tonight, you can stay inside. Just the other cot. He didn't move. just closed his fingers around hers. "I'll leave the lantern lit." Inside, the glow of the oil lamp threw soft gold against the wooden walls. The air smelled of herbs and clean blankets. Elias settled on the cot without a word. Miranda curled into hers across the room, back turned, but not closed off. "Good night," she said. Night. The silence wasn't heavy. It was something else. Something like peace with sharp edges. In the middle of the night, a knock came slow and deliberate. Elias was on his feet before the second knock. Miranda sat up, hand clutching the edge of the blanket. The third knock came harder. Elias opened the door, rifle in hand. Jebediah stood there with a deputy behind him. "Well," Jeb said, voice slick. "Heard you made her a wife." Elias didn't answer. The deputy cleared his throat. "We got a claim filed this morning in Gentry. Jebediah Whitlow says he's the last living male kin to the girls. Makes him their rightful guardian." Elias stood in the doorway, unmoved. They've got a home. They've got a mother. And now they've got a marriage certificate. The deputy held up a paper. "That's what I came to see." Miranda stepped into view, chin high. "It's real," she said. "Signed and witnessed. You're too late." Jeb's mouth twisted. "That don't change their blood. Their blood don't belong to you," she said. "Only their fear ever did." Delia appeared in the hallway behind her, eyes wide, holding Finch's cross. Jeb saw her. "You remember me, girl? I gave you candy." Delia stepped forward. "You took Mama's voice. We don't want your candy." Elias lowered the rifle just enough to make the point without the threat. "You've seen what you came for. Now ride out before I decide to push back harder." The deputy hesitated, but the quiet in the room, the kind that buzzed with finality, made his decision for him. He tipped his hat. "This marriage holds. Papers in order. As long as the girls say they're safe here, there's no call to force anything." Jeb looked between them, face hard and pale. "This ain't over." Miranda stepped to Elias's side. "Yes, it is. You just don't know it yet." Jeb turned on his heel boots, crunching over gravel. The deputy followed. When the door shut behind them, Miranda stood still for a long time. Delia came forward and wrapped her arms around her mother's waist. Elias put the rifle back on its hook. Miranda looked at him, and something inside her let go. Not all of it, but enough. She exhaled. The house, once filled with ghosts, had finally chosen its family, and the wind outside had shifted, not sharp now, but steady, pushing everything old into the past. He didn't promise forever, just safety, shelter, and silence when she needed it. The barn smelled of wood smoke and fresh-cut hay. The air was cool and still touched only by the quiet shifting of chickens in the nearby coop. Elias leaned against the stall wall, hands in his pockets, waiting. Inside the house, Miranda was getting ready. It wasn't a ceremony, not really. No dress, no preacher. No lace or flowers or songs. But there was meaning in the silence. There was weight in the choice they'd both made, and there was reverence in the simplicity of it all. She emerged just past sundown, the blue dress pressed as smooth as it would go, her shawl looped over her arms, hair tied in a thick braid that rested over one shoulder. Her steps were steady, not rushed. When she reached the barn door, Elias stepped out of the shadows. She paused in front of him, one hand brushing the doorway like a memory. "Delia braided my hair," she said, voice low. "She said if I looked nice, maybe you'd smile." Elias did. Just a little. Just enough. "You do look nice," he said. Miranda's eyes lingered on his shirt, pressed clean again, sleeves rolled to the elbow. She nodded. "I'm ready." The others were already inside. Hattie had laid out a quilt over a workbench near the back wall, and Finch stood beside it, with one hand on Delia's shoulder. Maisie sat on a stool, swinging her legs, a daisy crown askew on her curls. When Miranda and Elias stepped forward, Finch turned his head slightly toward them. "You found each other through fire," he said, voice gravel low. "Now you choose to walk beside one another through the ash and the bloom." He held out his hand. Miranda placed hers in his. Elias followed. Finch's thumb brushed over their joined hands. No rings, no vows needed here. Just this moment. Just your word. "I'll keep her safe," Elias said. "And the girls, too." "I'll stand with him," Miranda replied. "Wherever the wind leads," Finch nodded once. "Then it's done." Maisie clapped. Delia smiled, a small, soft smile. Hattie stepped forward, lifting a worn piece of parchment. Marriage license. County clerk signed it this morning. Stamped, sealed, and ready to keep Jeb's claws off your children. Miranda took the paper like it was something sacred. Maybe it was. Elias reached for her hand again. "We'll hang it in the house. Not to show off. Just so no one forgets where home is." Afterward, they walked back to the cabin in quiet, the girls skipping ahead with Finch guiding them gently. Hattie stayed behind to close the barn doors. Inside, Miranda lit the oil lamp. The girls set the table. Delia had picked flowers, scraggly wild things from the field, and placed them in a cracked mason jar in the center. Supper was simple. Warm bread, lentils, and sliced apples with a bit of honey. They ate together, the five of them, like it had always been this way. Miranda passed Elias a second helping. He buttered her roll. The girls laughed about the rooster who'd chased Maisie that morning. Nothing was forced. Nothing was grand. But it was whole. After the dishes were cleaned, Miranda stepped out onto the porch and stood in the dusk. Elias joined her arms, folded. "The girls fell asleep before I finished the story," she said. "First time in a long time, they didn't ask if the doors were locked. They know they're safe now. I hope so." He looked at her. "You don't have to hope anymore. You're here." Miranda nodded, but her eyes stayed on the stars rising one by one over the horizon. "I used to dream of getting away. Just the girls and me someplace no one could find us. But I never imagined a place that'd take us in without question." "You weren't taken in," Elias said. "You stepped in. That's different." She turned to face him. "You didn't have to offer marriage, I know. You don't even know if I can love you right. If I ever will." "I didn't ask for love," he said quietly. "I asked for trust. Love comes when it's ready." She swallowed, eyes shining. "I don't sleep easy yet," she said. "You don't have to." "But I rest now," she added. "That's something," Elias nodded. "That's everything." Behind them a board creaked. Delia stood barefoot in the doorway, her eyes half closed. "Can I sleep in the loft?" she asked. "The hay smells good." Miranda smiled. "Not tonight, sweetheart. Maybe tomorrow." Delia looked to Elias. "Can I go riding in the morning?" He smiled. "I'll saddle the horse at sunrise." The girl nodded and disappeared back inside. Miranda exhaled long and slow. She doesn't ask for things, not usually. She's learning she can. They stood in quiet until the lantern on the porch began to flicker in the wind. Miranda glanced toward the hills. "Do you think Jeb's really done?" No, Elias said. "Men like that don't walk away easy. What if he comes with papers next time?" A deputy, Elias thought for a moment. "Then we show them this paper," he said, nodding toward the marriage certificate framed now on the table. "And if that ain't enough, we show them who these girls belong to. By heart, not blood." Miranda reached for his hand, threading her fingers into his. "I've never had someone stand between me and the storm. You've got more than someone," he said. You've got family now. She squeezed his hand. You might have to stand again. One day soon. Elias's eyes didn't leave the horizon. Then I'll be ready. The wind picked up slightly, brushing past them like a whisper. Inside, Maisie's tiny snores reached them through the open window. Finch's voice, low and gravel-rich, began humming an old Cherokee lullaby as he rocked slowly in the corner. Miranda leaned her head against Elias's shoulder. She didn't speak again, but her silence wasn't empty anymore. It was full of something growing, and the stars above blinked brighter like the sky itself had taken notice. Down in the valley where the creek ran shallow and wide, the water shimmered with the reflection of the cabin lantern, steady as a heartbeat. And in the darkness beyond, dust stirred again, slow, deliberate. But the fence held. The door was locked. And this time, if trouble came, it would find 2 names on the deed and 4 lives unwilling to be torn apart. A town that won't share its bread might still send a hand when the water rises. The rain began before dawn, soft and steady, like a drumbeat muffled by cotton. Elias woke to the scent of damp earth and the sound of water tapping against the tin roof like a warning. He rolled from the cot, pulled on his boots, and stepped out onto the porch. The clouds hung thick and low, swallowing the tops of the hills. A muddy wind moved across the pasture. The horses shifted uneasily in the corral. Miranda appeared behind him, her shawl wrapped around her shoulders. It smells like the flood 2 springs ago. It's not that deep yet, Elias said, but his voice lacked certainty. Delia came down the stairs, rubbing her eyes, followed by Maisie, who held her carved stick like it could ward off storms. Miranda turned back toward the hearth, where Finch was already stoking the coals. The old man tilted his head toward the wind. "Creek'll jump its banks by mid-morning," he said. "I can feel it in my knees." Elias nodded. "I'll ride the lower fence line. If the cattle push past it, we'll lose half the herd." "I'm coming with you," Miranda said. "You'll stay dry," he answered. "Keep the girls safe." She met his gaze. "They're safe with Finch." He didn't argue. Some storms weren't meant to be faced alone. By the time they saddled the horses, the rain had picked up to a steady pour. The creek that ran through the edge of the property had doubled in width brown water, churning with branches and silt. 2 cows were already nosing the lowest part of the fence, nervous and shifting. Elias swung down, sloshing through knee-deep mud, and Miranda followed without hesitation. They worked side by side, roping and herding, dragging tree limbs from the fence line and shouting over the storm's roar. At one point, Miranda slipped, catching herself hard on one knee. Elias reached for her, but she pushed off the ground before he could touch her. "I'm fine," she said, breathless but determined. Elias didn't press. Her grit was something fierce. By noon, the field near the east pasture had turned into a shallow lake. The chicken coop tilted with each gust. Elias cursed under his breath. "I need to brace that coop," he muttered, "or we'll lose it." Miranda pointed toward the road. "We're not the only ones flooding." He turned. A wagon was stuck in the mud at the far edge of the trail. The axle was buried to the hub. A man stood beside it, waving both arms. "Is that Tom Miller?" Miranda asked. "Looks like it," Elias replied. "With his boy." Elias swung into the saddle and galloped down. Miranda followed. When they reached the wagon, Tom looked near panic. "Wheel snapped," he said. "My boy fell in trying to fetch the mule he's soaked through. I was trying to get to Hattie's place." Miranda leaned down. "He'll catch fever in this cold. Come with us. There's room by the fire." Tom looked hesitant. "I don't want to impose." "Then call it survival," Elias said. Back at the cabin, Finch made space near the hearth, while Miranda helped the boy out of his wet clothes. She wrapped him in dry blankets and laid him on the cot. Delia brought over the pot of beans she'd been stirring, and Maisie handed Tom a piece of corn cake from breakfast. "We ain't got much," she said solemnly, "but it's warm." Tom's face softened. "Thank you, little one." As the wind rattled the shutters, more knocks came. First came the Grangers, their roof torn half loose. Then came Ruth Davis, who'd been caught trying to drive her goat cart through rising waters. By dusk, the cabin was crowded with 7 extra bodies, all shivering, mud-streaked and grateful. Miranda moved like the center of a storm, quiet, efficient, tireless. She brewed tea with mint from her garden, tore extra linens for drying cloths, and found spare socks even Elias didn't remember owning. The girls helped, too proud to share their space like they were hosting a town hall, not a flood refuge. Tom pulled Elias aside near the porch. "Never seen her like that," he said, jerking his head toward Miranda. "A woman who doesn't hesitate. Just does what needs doing." "She's built like the land," Elias replied. "Worn down but still standing." Tom studied him. "I heard about Jeb. Heard you stood your ground." "I did what was right." Tom nodded. "It's easier to do what's right when the river's not rising." A sudden gust slammed the back door open, and Hattie Juniper marched in, dripping from head to toe. "Y'all better have coffee." Miranda burst into a laugh that surprised everyone, including herself. Hattie tossed her shawl on a hook. "Been patching roofs all morning. You've got a dozen folks over at the schoolhouse, but no heat. I told 'em the Black Fox place had fire and food." Elias raised a brow. "We're packed." "Good," Hattie snapped. "Then they'll be warmer, standing shoulder to shoulder." By nightfall, the cabin had become a gathering place, the center of something bigger than survival. Laughter returned. Someone brought out a fiddle. Miranda set out the last of the flour to make fry bread. Finch told an old story in Cherokee, and Maisie fell asleep halfway through, curled under the bench beside him. Delia leaned against Elias and whispered, "Are we a town now?" Elias looked around the room, muddy boots, patched knees, hands clasped in prayer before a humble meal. "We might be." When the storm finally broke, it was with a hush so sudden it felt sacred. The stars came out, and the land lay quiet, soaked and shining. The next morning, the townsfolk began to leave one by one, offering hands and thanks and shy smiles that hadn't been there the day before. Tom lingered. "County mayor wants to offer you something," he said. "They got new land opening up. Said you proved you can hold more than your own." Elias shook his head. "I don't need more land." Tom smiled. "You just gave shelter to half the valley and didn't blink. That counts for something." Elias watched Miranda step out into the muddy yard holding a pail of feed for the hens. She looked over her shoulder and smiled at him, real and wide. "That woman, Tom, said she's worth more than any deed." Elias nodded. "She's the reason the fence held." And as the sun rose over the ridge, warming the wet earth below the Black Fox homestead stood tall, not just a shelter, but a place where mercy outlived judgment, where roots, once torn, had finally begun to take. Under dust and moths lay a letter, a name, and a baby's blanket, proof that grief doesn't disappear, it just waits. The rain left behind a film of quiet that settled over the hills like a prayer. 2 days had passed since the last of the neighbors packed up and rode out, leaving the cabin a little too still in the absence of extra boots by the door and laughter echoing off the walls. Miranda scrubbed the floor on her knees that morning, not because it needed it, but because her hands couldn't bear to be idle. Elias was out checking the northern fence. Delia had gone with Finch to whittle by the tree line, and Maisie wandered the yard gathering wind-fallen leaves like treasures. The house was calm, save for the creak of floorboards beneath Miranda's scrub brush and the low whisper of the breeze through the open windows. She moved into the root cellar with a basket under one arm, checking stores, organizing jars, and wiping down shelves. She'd just pulled down a cobweb near the potato sack when her hand knocked against the edge of something wooden tucked behind the barrels of dried beans. She narrowed her eyes and crouched. It was a trunk, worn leather straps, iron hinges, the kind of box folks put away when they couldn't bear to look at it anymore. She hesitated, fingers resting on the lid. Then she opened it. Inside lay a folded baby blanket, yellowed with age, the stitches delicate and familiar. Beneath it, a bundle of letters tied with twine and an old photograph curled at the corners. Elias's face stared back at her from the picture, only younger, softer, holding a woman with eyes like firelight. Miranda's throat tightened. She sat cross-legged on the dirt floor and lifted the top letter from the stack. The paper was brittle, the ink faded, but the handwriting was neat. To my dearest Elias, if this is ever found, I hope time has made you gentler than grief ever allowed. She stopped reading. The air in the cellar shifted cooler somehow. She ran her thumb across the edge of the letter, then folded it carefully and placed it in her apron pocket. She didn't take the whole stack, just that one. When she came back up into the sunlight, Maisie met her at the door, dragging a branch twice her size. "Look, Mama," she said proudly. "It's shaped like a fish." Miranda smiled and brushed a curl from her daughter's cheek. "We'll carve it together later." She spent the rest of the afternoon in the kitchen shelling peas with deliberate focus, her apron still heavy with the letter against her side. That evening, after the girls were asleep and the porch lantern burned low, Miranda handed Elias the folded page without a word. He took it slowly, eyes scanning the paper. His hand trembled once at the bottom. "I forgot I'd left that down there," he said. "Figured it wasn't for looking at anymore." "She loved you," Miranda said quietly. He nodded. "Her name was Anna. She had kind eyes. She was kind," he said, "and brave. She died giving birth. The baby didn't make it either. After that, I put them both in the ground and packed the trunk before the dirt was dry." Miranda sat down beside him on the porch bench. The breeze carried the scent of sage and cut grass. The moon was pale and high. "I know grief like that," she said, "the kind you bury and hope never digs itself back up. I didn't know what to do with it. So I just built fences, and barns, and silence." She looked down at her hands, still smelling of peas and earth. "I thought my grief would make me weak forever. But it just made me careful." Elias folded the letter, tucking it between his palms. "I wasn't ready to make space for anything after Anna. Not for a long time." Miranda didn't respond right away. Then she whispered, "Are you now?" He turned his face toward hers, the porch lantern casting gold into the curve of his jaw. "I think I've already started," he said. She reached into her apron and pulled out the baby blanket, laying it between them. "I'd like to keep this," she said. "Not to replace anything, but to remember where we started." Elias nodded. "It's yours now. It always wanted to be wrapped around something living." They sat there in silence, the blanket between them, neither reaching for it, both guarding it. Inside the cabin, Finch stirred in his rocker, the floor creaking softly beneath him. Delia whispered in her sleep, and Maisie murmured something about horses and honey. Miranda leaned her head against Elias's shoulder. He didn't move, didn't speak, just let her rest there steady as timber. "I used to think I was broken," she said. "So did I," he replied. "Turns out we were just waiting." She reached for his hand and placed it on top of the baby blanket. "There's a letter I never wrote," she said. To the girl I used to be. I think maybe this house wrote it for me. Elias gave a slow nod, and I think the land is listening. That night, Miranda folded the baby blanket and placed it at the foot of the girl's bed. Delia reached for it in her sleep and curled her fingers into the edge like she knew exactly what it meant. Elias watched from the doorway. The home was full now. Not loud, not crowded, just full in the way a heart fills when it's finally been given room to stretch. Outside, the trees swayed gently. The creek was still high but no longer angry, and the road beyond the pasture gleamed faintly beneath the moonlight, quiet for now, but never empty. Elias stepped back into the house and locked the door with a slow, certain click. Whatever came next, he knew the weight of it would be shared. And this time the past wouldn't bury them. It would hold them up. You can't put a woman back in a cage she burned her way out of. The knock came just as the first blue light of morning stretched across the windows. It wasn't rushed. It wasn't loud. But it was heavy. Elias stood from the table where he'd been sharpening a blade and looked to Miranda. She stood frozen in the middle of the kitchen, her hands still wrapped in a towel from drying dishes. He opened the door slow. Jebediah Whitlow stood on the porch, a sheriff at his side holding a folded document with a red wax seal. He didn't smile this time. Just gave a half nod. "I'm here under order of the county court," the sheriff said, voice low. "There's a petition for custody signed and certified." Delia appeared in the hallway, Maisie behind her, both still in nightclothes, eyes wide and already knowing. Miranda stepped forward, voice calm. "You filed this yesterday." Jeb didn't answer. The sheriff did. Came in early. He claims he's next of kin to the children. Miranda's eyes didn't flinch. They're not his, and he knows it. The sheriff unfolded the document and read aloud, monotone. Legal words filled the air like smoke choking out breath. Petitioner claims moral unsuitability of current guardians. Marriage performed under duress. Lack of blood relation. Elias stood unmoved. We got the license. Witnesses. A home filled with proof. The sheriff looked at him. "I don't doubt it, but I have to investigate." "Then come inside," Miranda said. The sheriff blinked. "Ma'am, you came for answers, so get them." She turned on her heel, walked inside, and left the door open behind her. The sheriff stepped through. Jeb tried to follow. Elias stopped him with one hand against his chest. The lawman goes in. "You don't." Jeb narrowed his eyes. "I got rights." "Not in my house, you don't." Jeb's jaw flexed, but he stayed put. Inside, the sheriff looked around. The smell of breakfast cornbread and fried apples still hung in the air. A pot of mint tea steamed near the hearth. The house was clean, warm, lived in. Finch sat in the rocker near the window, silent as ever. Miranda motioned to the table. "Ask what you came to ask." The sheriff cleared his throat, clearly thrown off by her calm. "The petition says the girls may not have proper schooling, that they're isolated." Miranda nodded toward the bookshelf. "We teach here. Elias reads with them each night. Delia can recite psalms and Cherokee legends. Maisie knows her numbers past 50. The sheriff turned to the girls. "Do you feel safe here?" Delia stood straight. "Safer than we ever did before." Maisie whispered, "Papa Elias doesn't yell." The sheriff rubbed the back of his neck. "It also says you may have falsified documents marriage under false pretenses." Elias set the framed license on the table. Witnessed by Hattie Juniper. Signed by a county deputy. The sheriff scanned it. "Looks real." Miranda leaned forward, voice flat. "Let me ask you something, Sheriff. You ever seen a woman smile through bruises because she didn't want to get hit again?" He didn't answer. "You ever watch your child flinch when a shadow crosses the doorway?" still silence. Miranda's eyes burned now. That man out there gave them fear. This man here gave them beds and breakfast and a name that means something. The sheriff looked down at the license again, then back to the girls, then to Finch. What do you say Elder Finch rocked once? The land don't lie. This house is full of life now. You take that away, you don't just hurt the children. You break the roots of everything they've grown into. The sheriff nodded slowly. That's enough for me. He stepped outside and folded the document in half without reading it again. Jeb stood arms crossed. Well, I won't be filing charges, the sheriff said. Marriage is legal, girls are safe. Jeb's mouth opened, but no sound came. The sheriff tipped his hat to Elias and Miranda. You've got a good home. I'm sorry for the intrusion. He mounted his horse and rode off. Jeb lingered. Elias stepped onto the porch. Don't say it. She was mine, Jeb said, voice tight. He was my brother. His blood runs through them, and they ran from you. Jeb sneered. This won't be the end of it. No, Elias said, stepping closer, voice quiet. It already was. The day she walked through my fence line and said, take my girls. You just didn't know you lost. Jeb's eyes flickered. Not anger, not rage. Defeat. He turned and climbed into his saddle. The hooves of his horse were slow and heavy on the trail as he rode off. Inside the house, Miranda stood still. The girls clung to her sides. She reached down and drew them close. Delia looked up. Is he gone? Yes, Miranda said. For good, she paused. Yes. Later, after the door was locked and the windows drawn, Miranda took down the wedding license and replaced it with something new. A drawing Delia had made. Stick figures crooked but clear. 5 of them. Hand in hand, standing under a big sun. Elias saw it and said nothing. Just set his coffee beside hers and took the stool near the window. You didn't shake, he said softly. When he knocked. I shook inside, Miranda replied. But my girls didn't, he nodded. That means something. It means we're not running anymore. He looked out the window where the ridge met the sky. You did it, he said. She leaned against the frame beside him. No. We did. The day passed quiet. No storm, no visitors, just sunlight slanting through the wood slats and the hum of bees outside the sill. And in that stillness, for the first time in her life, Miranda believed that what she'd built wouldn't be taken from her. Not by blood, not by threats, not by the past. The girls laughed in the yard, chasing a chicken in a crooked circle, their voices high and clear. And Miranda, who'd once only spoken in whispers, walked outside and joined them. Love had filled every scar with gold. The smell of warm bread drifted out from the open windows of the cabin, mingling with the scent of cut grass and wood smoke. Elias sat on the porch steps with a knife in one hand and a piece of soft pine in the other, carving a small horse for Maisie's collection. She'd taken to leaving them on the windowsill each night, saying they needed to see the stars so they don't get lonely. Inside, Miranda was humming while slicing peaches into jars, her braid looped and pinned back, like she'd been born in that kitchen. The girls giggled as they washed the lids, splashing more water on themselves than the dishes. It was the kind of day that asked for nothing. No fixing, no mending, no defending, just being. Elias glanced across the yard, where Delia was showing Finch how high her tomato plant had grown. The old man crouched in the dirt with her, his hands tracing the leaves, as she described each one like she was telling a story. Every corner of the homestead buzzed with quiet life. A clothesline danced gently in the breeze. Chickens pecked the ground by the fence. The soil was dark and rich, fed by hard winters and careful hands. Miranda stepped onto the porch with a jar of tea and handed it to Elias. He looked up at her with the same steady gratitude he always had. But now there was something new in it, ease. "Smells like rain coming tomorrow," she said, sitting beside him. Elias nodded. "Good. Earth could use the soaking." She sipped her tea, then tilted her head toward the barn. "You ever going to build that extra stall?" He smirked. "Only if we're expecting more mouths." Miranda rolled her eyes. "Don't start that rumor. The town already thinks we've got secrets buried in the yard." "We do," he said, voice low and warm, "except ours grew roots instead of graves." She leaned against his shoulder and watched Maisie chasing a butterfly near the creek bed. "I don't jump at shadows anymore," she said. "I noticed," Elias replied. "I still hear echoes sometimes. Late at night, the old voices. But they fade faster now. Like they finally know they're not welcome. They were never welcome, just loud." Miranda set her empty jar on the step. "You gave me something I never had before." "What's that room?" He waited. Room to breathe. Room to hurt and still be seen. Room to raise daughters without fear swallowing them. Elias reached over and took her hand. "You gave it back." From inside, the girls burst out with laughter. Maisie came barreling through the door with a piece of bread in her mouth, shouting something about a frog in the flour bin. Delia followed, shaking her head. "Don't believe her," she said, smiling. "She put it there herself." Elias raised a brow. "Is that true, little one?" Maisie grinned, her mouth still full. "Maybe." They all laughed. The sun dipped lower behind the trees, casting the whole yard in gold. Finch, resting now in his rocker, nodded gently to the rhythm of the breeze. Inside, Miranda packed the last of the peach jars on the shelf and stepped back to admire the full rows. She traced the edges of the labels, each written in Delia's careful hand. Later that night, after the girls had bathed and were curled up beneath their patchwork quilts, Miranda tucked the baby blanket, once buried in grief, at the foot of their bed. Not to mourn, but to honor. Delia stirred. "Mama, yes, baby." "You ever think about where we were before?" Miranda sat on the edge of the bed. "Sometimes. But less and less." Delia looked toward the window. "This house feels like it's always been ours." Miranda brushed a lock of hair from her daughter's forehead. "Maybe it was just waiting for us to come find it." Delia closed her eyes. "I think God knew." Miranda kissed her brow. "I think so too." She stood at the doorway for a long moment, listening to the sound of their breathing, then turned off the lamp. Outside, the wind picked up slightly, rattling the porch lantern. Elias stepped out from the barn, wiping his hands on a cloth. "Feed's stacked for the week," he said. "Chickens are roosting early." Miranda crossed the yard to meet him. "I saved you a jar of jam." "You spoil me," he said, taking her hand. They walked to the fence together and looked out over the field where the moonlight painted the grass silver. "I used to think love was something big," Miranda said. "Loud and bright. Like thunder. And now I think it's this. This." She gestured to the lantern light, the quiet, the faint sound of Delia's laugh in her sleep. "It's something you grow. You don't chase it. You plant it and you wait." Elias looked at her. "And when it blooms." She turned to him, smiling. "It fills every scar with gold." He leaned down, kissed her cheek, and rested his forehead against hers. They stood like that until the night deepened and the stars blinked into view like old friends coming home. In the cabin behind them, the walls breathed with life. Not perfect, not loud, not tidy, but real. And for the first time in her life, Miranda didn't feel like she had escaped something. She felt like she had arrived, and the wind, that once howled like a warning now sounded like a hymn. The educational lesson learned from this story is that safety, dignity, and love are often built quietly, one steady choice at a time. Life may leave scars that never fully disappear, but patience, kindness, and consistent care can turn those scars into sources of strength rather than shame. Family is not only defined by blood or law, but by who shows up, protects, and stays when things are hard. Even later in life, it's possible to create peace not by erasing the past, but by giving it a better ending.